Today's video, I'm going to be giving you an overview of defenses in Path of Exile. This is going to be very surface level. The complexities of Path of Exile's calculations are much deeper, but this is going to be practical advice that you can apply to all of your characters to stay alive. A lot of players misunderstand at least just the most basic level of defenses, and they'll often forget things. So this is going to be like a theory of defense and how you can build your characters to be tankier. Before we speak about the defenses, we need to talk about the types of damage that players can encounter. The one that you need to think about is going to be hits, and then there are going to be other sources such as damage over time that do not originate from hits. So when I say hits, this is an enemy. He swings at you with his big axe. The other thing is also spells. Spells and attack hits both count as the same thing in PoE 2. They're both just attacks. So these are things that are hits. Damage over time effects that do not originate from hits are things like burning ground. So all those annoying ground degens, and in Abyss, you'll notice a lot of those little blobs and things underneath it. These are damage over time that do not originate from hits. But let's start out and talk about hits. So in order to become tankier, we need to think about this damage as an order of operations. First thing is avoidance. Can I avoid taking the hit entirely or avoid taking damage from this source entirely? The next thing is, once I have taken this damage source, can I mitigate it? Can I reduce this incoming damage? All right, we failed to avoid the hit. We have now taken the hit, and now can we reduce it? Third is, once we have failed to avoid the hit and reduce it, do we have the HP, the health pool, to survive that hit? And then the next thing, and this is the biggest thing that so many players forget, is once we have survived the hit, how do we recover that life? So recovery, this is the main thing. I promise you, so many people do not think about this. They'll think about these, but they forget about, hey, how do I get my life back? So let's talk about each of these defensive layers in a little bit more detail. So starting out with avoidance. If the damage source originates from a hit, can we avoid it? So primary avoidance layers that many of you will be familiar with are evasion rating. This is something that is popular on dexterity class characters. Another one could be block from shields. But then there are also other things, mechanical things like movement speed. This is the reason Deadeye is so popular. Can you just run away from the thing that is trying to kill you? Or are you able to maneuver around the battlefield or not run over those ground degens? Can you run away from that boss slam that's coming in? And then another thing would just be mechanical skill. So if you understand the fight and there is a big boss and he's coming to do a big slam, do you know the fight well enough that you can avoid just taking that hit entirely by just standing in the right place at the right time? So if this is his slam, you have the mechanical skill to know, okay, I need to stand here. There are also other avoidance things, such as from items like perfidy, chance to avoid physical damage from hits, or chance to avoid chaos damage from hits. So there are some other avoidance layers like that. For evasion-based characters like your Deadeyes and your monks, evasion rating is going to probably be one of the most popular avoidance layers. For characters on the left side of the tree, block tends to be a more popular avoidance layer option. And then, of course, movement speed is Deadeye gets that. And then mechanics, this is just skill-based. Now, some characters, and I'll speak about this a bit later, don't necessarily need to have one of these primary avoidance layers. If you're able to beef up some of your other defensive layers enough, you can get away with this. But there are some secondary avoidance layers that we can talk about. So things like stun avoidance. This is a big one. So let's say you're playing an energy shield based character with like 25,000 energy shields. Sure, you might not have an avoidance layer, but you might still be getting stunned a bunch. There are ways to reduce stun with things like stone charms and points on the tree that give you stun threshold and gear. There's also things like slow reduction with silver charms and again points on the tree, immunity to certain ailments like with dream fragments, so ailment avoidance, and also you can get ailment threshold increases on the tree which reduce your chance to have that ailment applied to you. Another thing could be reduced critical hit chance against you. There's a desecrated modifier that reduces your chance to be crit, but there are also things like unwavering stance, points on the tree like natural immunity that give you ailment threshold per dexterity. Another form of avoidance, and you could argue that this should be in the mitigation section, but that would be immunity. So am I entirely immune to X damage type or X ailment? Something like chaos inoculation, which makes you immune to both chaos damage and bleeding, or an item like dream fragments, you cannot be chilled or frozen. These are forms of immunity. So have a look at your character, see if you can identify your avoidance layers. If you are dying a bunch, it's likely either you are entirely lacking this avoidance layer or your other defenses are not robust enough to keep you alive. And so let's move on to the next step. That is mitigation. So the hit has come in and your character has been hit by it. You have failed to avoid the hit. What next? We need to reduce the incoming damage. With mitigation, we actually have two things. So we're going to have physical mitigation, and there is another form which is elemental mitigation. Let's first talk about physical mitigation. The most common form of physical mitigation is going to be armor. This is the most obvious one. If you're playing on the left side of the tree, a lot of players want to scale armor to reduce the incoming physical damage from hits. So one of the problems with evasion-based characters was that they struggled with this. They struggled with physical mitigation. They had excellent avoidance layers with high evasion rating, but when the hit eventually came through, they struggled when it was a big physical hit because they weren't able to reduce that incoming damage. With the introduction of deflection in patch 0.3, a lot of evasion-based characters now have this physical mitigation a little bit more sorted out. So with deflection rating provides a chance to deflect damage from hits, preventing 40% of the damage taken from those hits and ailments they inflict. If you do take a big physical hit and you are able to deflect it, you will mitigate that incoming physical damage. Now, another form of physical damage reduction would be damage taken as elementals, so something like Cloak of Flame. This is a great example. So instead of reducing your physical damage with armor, you're instead reducing it with your elemental resistances, which we'll get onto next. You can also get some generic forms of mitigation with certain items or things on the tree. An item like Ashrend has minus flat physical damage taken from attack hits. And then another one that is very popular and strong is Wind Ward on the Deadeye Ascendancy. Gain 3% less damage taken per Tailwind. So if you have 10 Tailwind stacks, you can get 30% less damage taken. Combine that with very high deflection rating, add Wind Ward, and you can see why even now, Deadeyes can be extremely tanky. They've got a very strong avoidance layer, and then when they do take a hit, they've got a lot of reduction. But now there's also the elemental damage reduction, and the most obvious source of this would be elemental resistances. So if you take a fire damage hit from like a spell or something, and let's say ordinarily this would deal 100 damage, if you have 75 resistance to fire damage, you would instead only take 25 damage. So this is a very obvious form of elemental mitigation. All characters in the endgame should have their resistances capped, at least their elemental ones, at 75%, unless you're doing something weird like using Veil of the Night on a Blood Mage build. But for the most part, having high resistances, very, very helpful. Of course, there is also chaos damage, so getting your chaos res capped Chaos is not an elemental damage type, but this will also reduce the incoming damage from Chaos. And then another new one that we have is percent of armor also applies to elemental damage. This can be scaled to further reduce incoming elemental damage and defend elemental damage with armor. So back in 0.1 and I think even 0.2, Cloak of Flame was an incredibly popular item. And that was mainly to do with the fact that physical mitigation sources were very hard to come by. And Cloak of Flame, what that does is it says 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage. So if you have 75% fire res or even higher, you could get it up to like 90%, and you take a physical hit for 100 damage, 40% of that would be reduced by your fire resistance. So you could effectively defend from physical damage with a very easy to scale mitigation layer, which is your fire res. So instead of taking 100 damage from that physical hit, 40% would be taken as fire and then reduced by 75%. So instead you would only take 70 because 40% of 75 is 30. So this would be reduced by this. This is equivalent to having like, I don't know, probably 3 billion armor. Now there are also some generic forms of less damage taken. So one of these would be, like I spoke about, Wind Ward earlier. And then other things like the Dancing Mirage, that is a unique body armor. Things like Bulwark on the passive tree. Heartstopper can be used to reduce damage over time. Enfeeble, this is a curse that makes enemies deal less damage. And then there's some more interesting ones like Defiance of Destiny. Recover X% of missing life before being hit by an enemy. And Grasping Wounds on the Blood Mage. 25% of life loss from hits is prevented. Then that much life is lost over 4 seconds instead. Those are other forms of mitigation. You can also get forms of critical hit mitigation with Perfect Essence of Seeking, which can reduce incoming critical hit bonus damage by up to 50%. And then points on the tree like Desensitization. Hits against you have 25% reduced critical damage bonus. So these are all forms of mitigation. Again, have a look at your character. See, how am I mitigating the incoming damage? If your character has no avoidance, so you're taking every single hit that is coming in, and you have no mitigation, which means you're taking the full damage of every incoming hit, you are going to die all the time, and it's going to suck. However, if you don't have an avoidance layer, but you have this mitigation layer stacked up with like 17 different forms of mitigation, then you might get away with not having an avoidance layer. Okay, so we've spoken about avoidance, mitigation. You've failed to avoid the hit. You have now taken the hit and you've reduced the incoming damage. The next thing is, do you have enough life to survive the hit? And this is where the next layer comes in, is HP. Now, HP is a simplified version of different health pools. So we could say HP could be life, as in just your life. You could also say it is energy shield. And then for characters playing Mind Over Matter, you could even say mana. So it's whatever your primary total life pool is, be it energy shield, mana, or life, or a combination of all of the three. If this defensive layer is not big enough, even if you have all the avoidance and all the mitigation in the world, if you take a hit, let's say you take a hit for 1,000 damage and you reduce it by 95%, now you're taking 50 damage, but your character only has 40 life, you are dead. So one of the things to also make sure is that you actually have a decent health pool or HP pool, again, being energy shield, life, or mana. You can scale life on gear, mostly gear. Flat life increases. You can also get some 5% life increases by doing your permanent buffs during the campaign. There are sources of percent increase max life on amulets. There's also some sources of percent increase max life on items like Veil of the Night. But currently, getting life to scale very high is pretty hard in Path of Exile 2 because there are very few sources of percent increase life in the game. Comb's Heart can be used to kind of get around this and just stack a ton of flat life. But let's talk about the next one, which is Energy Shield, which is the thing that everyone uses because you can get like 5 million Energy Shield by allocating 3 points on the tree. Energy Shield you get from gear, but all over the passive tree are scattered nodes that give you percent increased Energy Shield. This is why you can see so many characters running around with like 10, 15, even 20,000 Energy Shields. So in previous leagues, Avoidance layers, especially for characters on the top side of the tree like your witches and sorceresses, these characters actually don't have very obvious or strong avoidance layers. Like evasion rating or block, these are much harder to come by on these classes. So often what these players will do to compensate is just have a massive health pool. So they might take a lot of hits, but they have the mitigation and the HP or the energy shield to just soak that up. Similarly with mind over matter builds, who might just have a ton of mana, they can get away with maybe having weaker mitigation or avoidance layers, because when the damage does come through, even let's say they take a 10,000 damage hit, they reduce it by 50%. Let's say they have 15,000 energy shields. Well, now they're taking 5,000 damage. That's only a third of their health pool or energy shield pool. So this is an important thing to have and pay attention to. Are you life based, energy shield based, mind over matter based? So let's talk about the next defensive layer, and this is the one that most new players don't even think about at all. I would even say a lot of intermediate players barely think about this, but it is so overlooked and it is so important, and that is the defensive layer of recovery. We have mitigated the hits, we've reduced the incoming damage, and we have the HP to survive it. Now our life pool goes from this to this. How do we get that life back? So let's say that your character has 1,000 life, and after mitigation, you take 1 hit a second that deal 100 damage. After 10 seconds, your character is dead. So now let's instead say that your character has some form of recovery where you're getting back 50 life every second. So instead of taking 100 damage, well, you do still take the 100 damage, but every second you get back 50 life. Instead, now you are dying in 20 seconds or 19. I don't know. Let's just say 20 seconds. This is another form of defense and very overlooked. So let's talk about the two different types of recovery. And we have active recovery. This is recovery where you need to perform an action to get that life back. And we also have passive recovery. So for active recovery, these are things like leech. When you hit a monster, you get X amount percent leech on hit. There's also things like life gained on hit or life gained on kill. There are also jewels that grant you percent increase life recovered on kill. And there's also percent increase mana recovered on kill. Another it should be obvious, but it's not, is this thing over here. Your life flask, especially during the campaign, your life flask is super important because other forms of recovery are much harder to come by. So getting a life flask is one of the few forms of getting life back after you get hit. Another form of active recovery could be recoup. So when you get hit, you gain X% of that life back over the next 8 seconds. So these are all active. But then talking about passive recovery, these are harder to come by in PoE 2, but this would be life regen. So life regenerated per second. And then also mana regeneration rate. And for energy shield builds, things like energy shield recharge rate or faster start of energy shield recharge rate. These are forms of more passive recovery. So for life regen, like I said, it's quite hard. There are points on the tree. There are forms of flat life regeneration per second on gear. There's also things like vitality. This is a support that you can link with your buffs. And for mana regen, you've got things like clarity and plenty of mana regen scattered across the tree and on gear. And for energy shield recharge, again, it's all over gear, it's all over the tree. But these passive recovery is very important. And one of the biggest problems that most players face in both Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2, and you see them complaining about it constantly, is damage over time effects. So damage over time is a big problem for a lot of players, especially damage over time effects that do not originate from hits. Because you cannot avoid a hit with something like evasion racing, when you are just running over burning ground, you are now just taking damage over time. That can be reduced, it can be mitigated with stuff like your fire resistance, but with certain sources, like the big one this league was the ground effects from Abyss, those were really, really deadly to a lot of players because they may have had active recovery in the form of leech, but if there's no monsters standing around you, you can't get your life back. And if your life flask is empty, well, now you're just bleeding out. So a way to try and reduce this incoming damage is you can mitigate it, like I said, let's say burning ground with your fire resistance, but also having forms of just generic passive life regen or things like faster start of energy shield recharge. I think there's also a new spirit gem that you can force your energy shield to restart. It's on a long cooldown, but things like that. So again, look at your recovery layers. I guarantee that if you feel like you're dying a bunch, it's not only that maybe you don't have your elemental resistances at 75%, but it's most likely that you have neglected this layer of your defense. So what are your active recovery layers? Are you purely relying on a life flask? And also, is your life flask rolled well? Does it have good modifiers that increase the amount of life recovered? There's also a lot of points on the tree and on belts. One of the most underrated things in PoE 1 and PoE 2 is increased life recovery from flasks. There are some super strong things on the tree that can increase the effectiveness of your flask. And on belts, one of the most, this is like a modifier that a lot of people see and they just think it's like it's trash. But increase flask life recovery rate, like how quickly your life flask gets your life back, or flask charges gained, or reduce flask charges used. There are also some things on the tree like increased life and mana recovery from flask. These are things that people do not think about, but can actually be really good recovery layers for builds that may be lacking it. But have a look out on belts for like flask recovery rate modifiers and things like that. If you can scale enough of these, you can actually get a lot of life back from your flask. But also see like, do you have recoup if you're playing like a blood witch, a blood mage? Do you have other sources of active recovery? And then do you have passive recovery? This is something that is, like I said, it's harder to come by, so you might not have any sources of this, but it is something to still look at and see. Maybe you can get some life regeneration on gear. Maybe you've got like a couple of empty suffixes. You can throw in some life recovery or just life regeneration right there. There is one other hidden defensive layer that a lot of players rely on, and this is damage. If everything around you is dead, it can't kill you. So do you have good damage? Can you kill stuff before it kills you? Again, another reason Deadeye and things like Lightning Arrow are so popular is because this has insane coverage. It has really, really, really good clear. So you are shooting monsters off screen. Your projectiles are chaining left and right. You're standing over here. This is like your character's screen, and stuff over here is already dead. Same thing with bosses. If you can just burst down a boss in like 2 seconds, it doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about avoidance or mitigation or HP or any of that, because the boss is dead before it even touches you. So another thing is, can you just kill stuff before it kills you? Have a look at your damage, see if you can scale it up a bit, and how is your clear, how is your single target, all of that. This is a very, very important layer, of course, damage, but it is something that does need to be discussed when it comes to defenses, because again, like I said, if you can kill stuff before it kills you, it can't damage you. And this is also why so many players hate on-death effects. It's because this is their defensive layer. They just want to kill stuff before it kills them, and then when this big guy goes red and explodes, well, now you actually have to play the game. I'm not defending on-death effects. I hate on-death effects. They also suck, but it does stuff to you after you've killed it. Well, now you're going to get wrecked. You've neglected all your other defensive layers, then those on-death effects are extremely, extremely punishing. So let me know what you think. I do have a written guide of this over on Mobalytics where you can think about it. You've got avoidance, mitigation, HP recovery, and then I should probably just add damage. You're going to have a read through this, but have a look at your build, especially if you're dying a whole lot, and see if some of these layers are missing. Again, just to reiterate, you don't necessarily have to have every single one of these layers. Mitigation and HP, these can be combined into what a lot of people refer to as max hit, as in what is the maximum hit you can take before you die. This can be a robust enough layer that you can forego having an avoidance layer, especially if you have a good recovery layer. So if you have 20,000 energy shields and you take 5,000 damage hits all the time, but you are recovering 4,000 every second or even more, then you can kind of don't have to worry about this. But just, this is something to think about. Just visualize it in your head that the swing comes in. Can you avoid it? If you don't avoid it, can you reduce the damage taken? After you've taken that damage, do you have enough life to survive it? And then how do you get the life back after you have lost it? Let me know what you think. I'm also going to include a guide from Dreamcore, who we all know and love. He's written a PoE 2 damage and defense full order of operations. This goes into more depth and it's more accurate. Like certain things that I explained, like with block, that's not actually like the first layer of defense. It's a bit more complicated than that, but just to help you visualize it, I put things like block in that primary avoidance layer, even though it's slightly different. So I'll link these both in the description. Have a read. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Just double check that you are subscribed. I'll be live over on Twitch playing my new Blood Mage build. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. I'll catch you in the next video, and bye-bye.